after I plug in my computer real quick. My coach is laughing at me in the corner of the room right now. The structure of this is I'm basically just going to start by talking about like a little bit of, I think, the mindset that people should have when it comes to research. Then I'll talk about like big picture kind of strategies when you're talking about specifically researching for worlds. And then I'll go into like the in-depth, like how do you actually do the research? And I'll do a couple of examples on the November-December motions. So the first thing, and this is like super important to me because people at my school usually aren't familiar with the research process. And so I think it's really, really important to acknowledge is that researching is like not an easy thing. In my case, I spent literally 2 seasons doing policy debate and then another couple of years doing Lincoln Douglas debate. And my school didn't have any databases during that time. So I was just like going on the internet, doing my best to research things. And Worlds was actually a really good avenue for me because it meant that I didn't have to rely on having access to databases because Worlds is so much more accessible than other events. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that like researching is difficult. So if you're having a hard time researching, don't feel bad about it. Just be patient with yourself because it's not like an easy thing. And I think that sometimes we debaters kind of assume that it's like a given that you know how to research. Really briefly, the 2 reasons for this is first, that literally Americans don't know how to read the news. Half of American adults can only read at or below 6th grade reading level. Again, I'm acknowledging this because there's definitely been times like in my debate career where I was like researching something and I didn't know what a word meant, or even I didn't know what a word in emotion meant and I felt stupid. Don't feel stupid because that's pretty typical, especially if you like go to a public school. And then the second thing is that there's also like a lot of paywalls, elitism, and obscurity when it comes to academia because it's just not made for high school students. And so feel good about yourself if you're actually putting in the time to research a world's case, especially because a lot of world's debaters won't actually do that time. So getting into like world-specific kind of strategies. I think the most important thing to remember for Worlds is that it's always been an event that has very, very specific norms. That's why at the National Speech and Debate Association Nationals tournament, they spend so long drilling into judges that this is exactly how you should approach judging a Worlds round, because there's these very important stylistic conventions, and this makes researching a little bit different for Worlds. So first thing is what not to do. I'm putting this in here because a lot of times people enter Worlds from other events. I definitely did, and I definitely made some of these mistakes. So there's some really important things not to do when you're researching for Worlds. First thing is that you don't want to say Williams 20 like you would an LD in policy. It's so tempting to do this, but it doesn't work because in Worlds, we're focused so much more on persuasion, telling a story when you're researching something, actually explaining what a statistic or what an anecdote means. That just isn't worth it for you to say Williams in 20, or according to a study by George Mason University in 2020. Most of the times, these things don't fit into your cases because they're not actually very persuasive to the judge listening in the back of the room. On top of that, I think another very common mistake that even sometimes more intermediate Worlds kids make is that you don't want to use evidence in place of analysis. This is so difficult to do because you hear that Worlds really values examples. And so you think that the example enough is important, but you want to have the example and the analysis. So make sure that you use evidence, but you also explain the story behind it because Worlds is really all about that story, all about that persuasive aspect. So what does this look like? My favorite piece of advice that I've probably ever gotten in debate was from Pam Wyckoff. I met her in 2022 at the Blake tournament, and she was so amazing. And she's actually the founder of Original Oratory. And her big piece of advice for World Schools debaters is to think that every word should have meaning. And what that basically means is that when you're giving a world speech, even though it can be really easy to rush through it, or you can get stressed, or somebody asks a POI and it throws you off, you're always trying to make sure that everything that's in your speech, everything that you're preparing and putting into your case should have some type of intent. So that in the case of researching, in the case of using evidence in your world's cases, that should generally mean that you know why you're putting a piece of evidence in there. You're not just trying to fill your time, but rather it's humanizing an impact, adding clarity to a model, or somehow helping that story, helping that overall narrative. Some quick examples would be, this house believes that the acquisition of startups by large corporations does more harm than good. For that case, I would say you want to research it to find some type of like international example, and then maybe you use that example in your model to kind of, or not your model, in your framing to explain what the motion looks like. Maybe that is a case where you should have a couple of statistics and some actual numbers because it's so economics focused. or you want to cite the very specific laws that a bunch of different countries have when it comes to the acquisition of startups by large corporations. Those are some cases where you're using your evidence, but you're using it in a way that actually has a point and thinking about how it fits in your case as a whole. Another example is this House believes that the environmental rights of future generations supersede the economic interests of current generations. In this case, I would say that you probably won't have as many numbers because there's just a lot of things that like people already know about climate change or that are already like you're able to say with a lot of like big statements. For example, that higher income countries are responsible for the majority of climate change. Maybe you need a little bit of evidence to back that up, but you can also probably explain that through a story by telling about how a certain country exploited a lower income country to get where they are. In that case, I think that the evidence that you're using is probably more based off of that narrative and off of, kind of that storytelling aspect again. Whereas on an economics mission, maybe you would have a little bit more numbers. The point is, when you're constructing your cases and putting research and evidence into them, you want to be very, very intentional about how it fits in with that case and with your team's overall strategy. If something is not going to be useful in the 2, the 3, and the reply, then oftentimes you should wonder why you're putting it in the first place. Maybe it's not that the reply is explicitly saying it, but it should still probably have some relevancy, some importance in the debate round as a whole. So with all of that out of the way, that's kind of how I would approach like the big, the mindset about research and then the way that you should strategize about putting research into your debate cases. This is like the section that's just about how do you actually do this, because I think that that's very difficult. It's easier said than done. The first thing is I think that background knowledge is probably most important in worlds than like any other format. Maybe extemp needs a little bit more background knowledge, but worlds, I think it's pretty important. It's a really important part of the equation. When you're trying to research, you can spend so long researching something that at a certain point you're no longer efficient. But if you have background knowledge and have worldly knowledge and know what's going on in just the world around you, you're going to be a lot more efficient and hopefully have to spend a lot less time with that research and with actually, going onto Google, learning what the words in the motion mean. And it gets so much easier. Some like general big picture things about this is that if you have background knowledge, you're going to know terms of art. Sometimes terms of art will appear in the motion. I think that example of this was I once heard a motion that was about like the use of classic curriculum in high school English classes. And then there was an info slide that used the term canon. And I was very, very lost in that round because I had never heard the term canon. But if I had been reading a little bit more about like book bans and the curriculum used in English classes, hopefully I would have heard that term and then not have been so confused in that round. That's just an example of why building up your background knowledge can help you a lot. On top of that, you learn how to condense and get the gist. Once again, that means that you're just spending less time having to do your research and, you can figure out what something's saying a lot faster. And then I think that generally speaking, maybe not in every case, but in most cases, you're definitely a lot better off if you understand big picture concepts and then can study up on the specifics for a motion. An example of that was that there was a power sharing agreement that was debated at the Winter Holiday Open last year. And the topic was, in post-conflict societies, this House would support the use of power sharing agreements over outright democracy. In that case, you can study up on very specific power sharing agreements, and you can study up on post-conflict societies and how they go about implementing direct democracy. But if you know that oftentimes a post-conflict society might be having high ethnic tensions or getting straight out of a civil conflict, if you know that direct democracy has XYZ issues, and if you know that a power sharing agreement means that different factions have, required veto power or have set coalitions, you're going to be a lot better, and then you can just study up on those specifics because you know generally what's going on. Another piece of knowledge that might be important for a motion like that is just knowing that authoritarian governments have been on the rise internationally, or that populism is really strong in Europe right now. Just like those pieces of background knowledge that might come up in rounds that will help you seem smarter generally and then make your research a lot easier. So ways to build up your background knowledge. The first thing is that I always recommend that people read a bunch. I think that one of the things I've always noticed about Worlds kids is that they are so well read. And I think it's because Worlds topics can transfer so many different things. In 1 year, if you're doing Worlds every single weekend, you'll debate so many different topics compared to other events. And so reading books that just talk about the world are really helpful. I put some really, really boring, really dense books right here. They're all very hard reads. I have not yet finished Caste because I can only read one paragraph at a time, but really famous book because it's really fantastic. Same thing with Sapiens, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and A People's History of the United States. I think that the much easier way to go about building your background knowledge is that you try to build up knowledge on things that interest you. I put some like random examples of like how I've found building up background knowledge really fun. I'm really interested in art history, so I've learned about like Basquiat and Banksy, and then when you read about those artists, you'll learn about the political context that they existed in. I had an obsession when I was in middle school with learning about equal rights amendment activism. I also had an obsession with Elizabeth Holmes for the longest time, so I watched like 3 different documentaries about her. I recommend the one on HBO. If you want to learn about feminism, read the works by like Roxane Gay, or read poetry. Or if you're interested in learning about forms of governance, there's this documentary show on Netflix that's like super dramatic, but it's called How to Become a Tyrant. Those like different things that like are just like around you in pop culture can be really good ways for you to like, you know, do deep dives and learn about things that you're interested in. So I don't think that this has to be like as miserable as reading books that might make you really sad. Anyways, last thing I'll say about background knowledge before I talk more about like how do you like actually prep a case is you can also always sign up for these emails that a bunch of different organizations offer. These are like some like really good news organizations and a few specifically that offer international knowledge. But almost every news group will have like a daily email that they can send to you. And then you can also follow them on social media and turn on notifications. I do this. I know that Sunju Yoon, who was a debater on USA a couple years ago, was a really big fan of Twitter notifications. I prefer Instagram, but use whatever social media platform you want, follow a news organization, and turn on your notifications. So then every single time there's breaking news, you'll find out some way when you open your phone. Next thing is that there's a lot of different databases that I suggest using. And I'll talk about a few that I think are specifically really helpful for worlds. First thing, and I'm going to come back to these at the end and like give an example of a motion and like go through how I would go about prepping it, is that there's a lot of like general databases that will just have like a ton of knowledge. All of these are like really good sources that are all free. Like I said, I did not have access to any school-based databases for the longest time in my debate career. But all of these websites will have different kind of like sets of information. I really recommend that for Worlds Kids specifically, you read things that call themselves literature reviews, because those are the things that will often go into the historical analysis of a topic, and that's usually the most relevant for Worlds. What's really, really convenient about this event actually is that you often don't have to read the like methodology of an article. You can read the abstract, and because Worlds is so example focused, you'll have an idea of kind of what happened, and then you can like usually read a news article or something that's more casual to fill in any questions you might have. And I'm going to come back to these. These are also some really good websites. I highly recommend all of these. This one is one that I found last year when I was researching power sharing agreements. But it's not just power sharing agreements. It's all peace agreements globally. So you can read about things like the UN Accords. And it's in a very digestible, very like modern search engine format. This one I also like literally just recommended to somebody who's researching the political parties motion for the TFA motions. That topic is like, this House regrets the dominance of the two-party system in American politics or something like that. And this is a website that has international systems for elections all listed out in like a Wikipedia format. So you can just like go through them. Like for instance, you could click on like first past the post and it'll have a list of pros and a list of cons and then a list of countries that use either system and a bunch of examples baked into it. And I think that that's like an incredible landmine of political kind of information. If you want to learn about lobbying in the United States only, this is a really good website that releases like a lot of data and analysis on it. I think that can be really helpful, especially since like Worlds does seem to have a lot of motions that are about like government corruption. And so reading up on those and knowing some examples can be handy. Human Rights Watch, I really recommend. Actually, Human Rights Watch and Freedom House, these second two I'm going to group together. I really recommend those two for Worlds debaters because they have information about every country's context. So if you go to Freedom House, they have the democracy index that they give to every single country that will basically describe like the score that they get for, I think it's like civil liberties and democratic rights There's 2 categories, and then it explains why they have that score and a lot of the reasoning behind that score. So it will basically tell you kind of where that country's at and give you a lot of the story behind a country, which is very, very important for worlds, because especially if you're debating against people from many different backgrounds or debating people internationally, you don't want to be like the dumb American who doesn't know what's going on in the world. You don't want to accidentally say something that's offensive about somebody who's from a country that you're debating about. And so reading up and knowing kind of what's going on in different countries is so helpful. And then those 2 organizations also release like information about like the health of democracy worldwide and like different regional kind of issues. The Economist Intelligence Unit, you have to like sign up and say that you're a researcher from an academic institution, but also has a lot of really great information, very similar to the 2 above it, except for it's usually more economics focused. But like I said, like worldwide kind of like reports that issues. And then the last one, and this one's a little bit niche, is Headwaters Economics. I like this one for US centric debates because you can like search different kind of areas in the country, and it will tell you kind of environmental threats that are going on there, the status of racial justice, give you like an economic profile. And it's really interesting. And it also lets you compare different areas. So like if I went to this website right now, it has like a spot where I could enter like Mount Vernon, Washington and Dallas, Texas, and then just see the difference between those communities. Not necessarily too helpful for like international context, but definitely an interesting one to explore. Next thing I'm going to say is when you're using these websites, they're probably going to hit a lot of paywalls. So some really quick strategies are to ask your friends if they have access to anything. Shout out to my friends from Texas who have sent me articles from JSTOR when I need them. If your friends have access to databases that you don't, they'll often have a lot of information unlocked. This one actually recently, or not like recently, pretty soon, like in the next few months, it's going private. But for now, you can still use ZLibrary, which has a lot of access to books. I use that one a lot when I was doing policy debate, but I think that accessing entire books can sometimes be really helpful because if you find it in the source of something and then go to it, oftentimes you'll find that they have like a whole section on the history of something. And like I said, I think that understanding the history behind things is really important for worlds specifically. Oftentimes, if you just add a dot after the .com in a URL, it'll get you past a paywall. It doesn't work on the Atlantic, but it does work for like New York Times and Washington Post. 12-foot IO, I can't use this one at my school, but I can use it when I'm at home, and it looks like this, and you just enter the website. And then you can also refresh a page and then click the little X that pops up when you click on the refresh button to like stop it from completing its refresh, and then oftentimes that will get rid of the paywall. That one I use mostly on Washington Post. Between all of these, I've gotten past most paywalls. The only one that I think is really bad is the Atlantic, but the Atlantic has recently been really sketchy, so just don't read the Atlantic. Next thing. Next thing I'll say is I also really suggest that people who are learning how to research or trying to like do case writing in preparation also kind of focus on learning how to learn to when you should read something in full or versus when you should skim something. That's, I think, part of the reason why reading the news is so hard for people, because if you're doing like a really close read to everything like you might do for English class, it's going to take you a long time. But if you know that you need to like specifically focus on those history sections and you need to focus on the abstract, then you're going to be a lot better off. So some examples. If you're reading like a peer-reviewed journal article, you can read the introduction, the conclusion, and if it's good and if it's saying what you want to and what you need to like read about, then you can find some more specifics in the actual text. Footnotes on anything that is close to what you want it to say or says what you want are really useful. You would be like shocked how many authors will like you'll like read the source that's included in a footnote, and then you'll find out like that there's like some perfect piece of information you were looking for that was just like excluded in the original article you were reading. A lot of like news articles will mention things in passing and not explain them. Let me see. I can't get the article open. This is a political article that I was reading for Nationals that was all about reality TV. And it just casually lists off a bunch of reality TV politicians that got elected, but it doesn't explain any of them. It just lists them off. But that's an example of when you really want to like look into those things that like might be mentioned and you might be questioning if they're relevant, because oftentimes they will be. And then I would also recommend finding things that are like collections of articles. This is one from Headwaters Economics that was really helpful a couple of years ago on an environmental topic, because it's literally just a collection of different articles and different opinions about public land use. And then the last thing is that you should use Control F to filter out articles, because if you click like Control F when you're on a PDF, and I'll show this in a couple minutes, it'll take you to every single mention of that word. And I'll show this when I go back to those databases. Last thing, or almost last thing, next thing I would say is also use Google, because Google is so helpful and so many people dismiss it because they don't think they'll get like really academic articles. You obviously ignore Wikipedia, ignore things that are sponsored, but if you type in what you're looking for, you'll usually be able to find a lot of background information. And I think that this is especially true for worlds, because oftentimes if you're searching on an American database that's focused on like US-centric literature, you might miss some very important kind of worldly knowledge or global context. Last thing I'll say before I get into like some more concrete examples is build team infrastructure. That's been something that's really important for my team to get by, is that we like basically depend on us all, you know, having access to this document, which is basically what I included in this presentation, but some information about how I would go about researching for policy debate. It's really important that you support your teammates, especially in the process of researching, because it is something that is so difficult. All right, I'm going to go back now and show an example. Is that you? Okay, so I'm only going to show a few of these. I pulled up the world's motions from October and December because I'm not allowed to give examples from the September and November ones because USA is going to that. But anyways, I'm going to start by looking at this motion, which is this House will implement a living wage. A few like things I'll go over on this motion. First thing I would recommend is if you're actually communicating with your team, you'll know if a topic is being reused across events. This is so important because LDers on your team, by the time you're debating this in Worlds, will have already been debating this for a month. And so they'll already have cases, already have done a lot of the research. And oftentimes LDers run arguments that can really easily translate into principles. So if you're working with your team and develop that team infrastructure and like those relationships with your teammates, you'll have like a set of information already ready on this topic. And you'll probably have somebody on your team who, if you ask them, could give you a ton of background knowledge. So that's the first little thing. And I think the reason the TFA chose that motion was probably because it's a really accessible motion because so many teams will have already prepped it. The next thing I would say about this motion and generally about how I approach like thinking about research and finding evidence for worlds is I usually start by listening out stakeholders. This was something that they were really adamant about on the developmental team, but it's really to each their own. It's just a preference of mine. So like, for instance, this is just like a list of like random stakeholders who might be affected. You'll notice that, like some of these are a little bit more niche. I would say like the last three, like people might not like immediately think about how those people are like indirectly affected by implementing a living wage. But I would really recommend that if you're researching something and you're like just really beginning your process of looking into a world topic, it never hurts to be very generous in who you're counting as a stakeholder. It can only really help. An example of like when that was like relevant was that a while ago there was a Congress bill in Washington State that was about like banning the use of fireworks. And there was this really niche argument that members of my team ran that was all about how Indigenous communities would be hurt by stopping fireworks sales because so many Indigenous communities have really strong economies built off of selling fireworks to people outside of just 4th of July. So, you know, make sure that you think about those diverse stakeholders and don't limit yourself, particularly if you're just researching something, because like you're jumping into the process. You shouldn't be afraid of finding a lot of information. Can y'all still hear me? Ooh, I'm gonna go on with that because then you guys can see yourselves. Okay, I hope y'all can still hear me. I've been yapping for a while.
We can still.
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay, good. Then I'll keep going. Okay, sorry, somebody unmuted. Anyways, so this is like the first one that I have listed here, or the second one. The core database I think is really helpful. I really recommend it for Worlds because it's based in the UK. And so if you're trying to get out of just reading about the US and just reading literature about something from the US, I think that's super helpful. So for instance, I just typed in the term living wage. Don't use really complicated searches because they're not usually going to get you what you're looking for. And this one is all about like the US, but it's about different like living wage campaigns. This is one about like a historical piece of context from London. There's another one on here. But like you can see, there's just a ton of different like big picture context that could be pretty relevant if you're trying to like learn more about the topic or like build up your knowledge. Probably opening any of these articles is going to give you the opportunity to read at least some abstract and at least some context about the motion. I'll go there in a minute. Another thing that I recommend is, once again, when once you find an international source, like one that you know is reporting on international politics, I would recommend typing in that source followed by just like one of the terms that you're looking for. And oftentimes you'll get like what's effectively a list of examples that you can go and research further. So in this case, I literally just typed in DW News, which I believe is based in Germany. But it's like an international news organization, and living wage. And the first one was about Germany, and it's about minimum wage, but very similar about like the increases, and still something that's very much relevant on this topic. If this will load. Then there was one about Nigeria. Then there was one about the EU. And all of those are about minimum wages, but once again, those debates are very much interconnected. And there's a ton more. There was one about Spain on here, one about Russia, and like the same thing is true for effectively most international news organizations. Another one that I had listed on here somewhere is France 24, which I also really recommend. Anyways, but this is an example of how you can use Google effectively, because now that you know that Germany, Spain, Russia, Nigeria, the EU have all had these various initiatives, you can read this first article, and it's probably not going to be the extent of your research. You're probably still going to want to know a lot more about how it can actually be used in your case. But once you have this information, you can put it onto an example document that your team can use in the round, or you can use it like read more about it, see what the actual impact of it was, and like maybe put it in your actual case. Or maybe there's like a unique stakeholder that's mentioned in one of these articles, or it shows you how there might be really big differences between low and middle income countries versus higher income countries. All of those things can help you put together a pretty good case, but only if you go through the process of kind of trying to extend beyond what you might already initially know and try to do some more research on it. The next topic I wanted to like look at a little bit was this motion. This house regrets the narrative that democracy is the best form of governance. This topic is definitely one where I would recommend that you focus on knowing the big picture of what's going on in the world, and then you can use very specific examples in your cases or prep specific examples that you want to use in the round. But those examples can only really be used if you know what's going on generally. So, for example, this is where I would pull up the Freedom House as like a way to research. And if you just like scroll on the Freedom House website, they have all this information about the state of democracy worldwide. And a lot of these articles are also going to be about things that are very, very current. And so they're great examples for worlds because you're talking about something that's happened in the last few weeks that maybe your opponents have already caught up on, or you're the one who gets to look smart by knowing about something that's going on in the world right now. So, for example, here's one about authoritarians in the freedom movement. This is probably very relevant, promoting global democratic landscape. A turbulent start to the year of global elections. This is actually really important. If you're doing your background research this year, there's like, I want to say an insane amount of the world this year is going to be voting. I think it's half of the world's global population will be voting in an election this year, or will have the or like it's in a country that's hosting an election, something like that. And so if you know these things, you can like be able to search out very specific information about that. This is probably very relevant to the perception of democracy and narratives about democracy worldwide. Perhaps this one as well, because it's once again about kind of the social narrative and how we are looking at democracy. I can show the country's report real quick as well. This is what I was talking about a few minutes ago about how the Freedom House offers specific scores. It's political rights and civil liberties, and they have on here descriptions of what that means. Democracy scores as well. And this is like not only very helpful for that motion about the perception of democracy and narratives around democracy, but also very important, once again, for building up that background knowledge, which I think is probably the key to informed worlds debate. And I also want to pull up the Human Rights Watch, maybe. And I also want to pull up this one. Similarly. This is the Human Rights Watch. I think a lot of debaters use the Human Rights Watch, but don't necessarily use it in the most effective ways, because they'll use the Human Rights Watch as like this source that only has like very specific data. But I think that the better way to use the Human Rights Watch is to use it as like a way to get context about what's going on in a country. So if you're going into a World's Round and you know that your team is only citing 2 or 3 international examples, which, let's be honest, a lot of World's teams do kind of fall into a trap of using the same examples over and over again, it's really helpful if you actually know the context of what's going on in that country. So if your opponents, push back on it, you know how to respond and refute them. But on top of that, it'll make you seem a lot more knowledgeable and probably make you feel a lot more confident in using those examples. So I think an example of that would be, the NSDA Nationals in 2024 had a topic about the elections of reality TV politicians. And there was a lot of examples that were coming out of Europe because Europe has had such a strong wave of populism last year. But if you're not reading about, how, for instance, Italy elected Giorgia Meloni, or, the status of populism generally across the continent, then you might be a little bit more hesitant to use those examples. Or if your opponent responds and says something that's very US-centric that doesn't actually apply to the country you're talking about, you won't know that if you're not knowing the general context about the country you're talking about in the first place that you brought up. Yes, you can use my data. The next website that I also recommended, and this is one of the ones that came off of the database sheet, was this one, which is from, again, not a US source. This is part of what, kind of a little segue. This is part of why I think that's so important to build team infrastructure, because especially for Worlds, especially if you're trying to become a school that's competing in Worlds a lot, you're going to want to know your international news. And I think that's only something that happens if you're keeping track of these different resources that you're finding. Because it's really hard because of algorithms and the way the internet works and whatever. It's incredibly difficult to find information that is not US centric if you're living in the US and mostly only know people from the US and surrounded it with, only information about the election, for instance. So when you find these resources, save them. Anyways, so the University of Edinburgh, I would go, this is the one that I use most often. This one's really helpful because, once again, it's a database, but it's going to effectively generate what I think offers a list of examples. So I don't want to be too limiting because I want it to actually be helpful. Okay, I'll put in Africa, and I'll put in governance search database. Okay, show me them. There we go. See, and this will give you basically when an agreement was signed, the country that was involved, and then if you click on it, it'll give you a little bit more information about the specific agreement. These are incredibly helpful because this is basically, once again, just a list of examples that you can use. You can make your searches very, very specific on this website, and then you have all this knowledge. And it's not going to be enough to just know that peace agreement happened. But if you have a list that is exactly what you were looking for, the exact examples that you were searching for, then you can go onto Google, go and type in, DW News or France 24 and find a little bit more information about what actually happened in the case of a specific peace agreement. Or go on any other database and do some more in-depth research. Hold on, let me go back here real quick. I really want quickly, before I probably just ask if anybody, I don't know if anybody's in the Google Meet, if anybody has questions. The other ones on here, PubMed is very US-centric in my opinion. It's useful for medical topics because anything science related will have stuff on there. I think that a lot of people get scared by the name because it sounds like it would only be things about medicine, but I think that there's a lot of general science stuff on there. For example, there was a topic where famine was very relevant recently, and PubMed had a lot of stuff about whether or not famine is something that has a transgenerational impact. And then by reading those articles, there was a lot of information about countries that have experienced extreme famines. The core database is the one I showed a little bit ago that is from the UK. That's very helpful. I don't like Google Scholar. People swear by Google Scholar, but it does not work generally well for me. So use it if it's your cup of tea. Hide Online is U.S. law, which is not the most helpful if it's a topic that is not specific to the U.S., but can have some nice context. It's definitely worth noting. And what's really nice about Hide Online is that it's free for anybody who is an NSDA member. So you log into your account on speechanddebate.org, and then you can access Hide Online. Academia, that's a really good one. I should show that one. You have to make an account on Academia. I feel like they kind of try to confuse you because they make it seem like you absolutely have to download they make it seem like you have to, have premium or make like an account or pay, but you don't. You can make an account as a student and then use it for free. There's like limited results because you're on free, but if you're doing the right searches that are going to lead you to background information, then it's okay. Wiley Online Library is another one that I would really recommend. I feel like it usually gets me the most broad results, and everything on it is usually free. And they have like a lot of different subjects. It's not like PubMed where it's only science stuff. I think that's very broad. ERIC is a really niche one, but it has information about international education systems, very focused on the US, but their search function is very good. So if you use that one, you'll have free access to all their articles, and you can also filter it to make sure that you're getting international results and like look at, data about international schooling systems, but it's only good for educational topics. And then Science Direct is another one, free, but again, as the name would suggest, is very sciencey. From there, you go back to your document, you think about those stakeholders that you might find in your research, and you really use those to develop your examples, because those examples are what's most helpful if you're thinking about worlds in terms of putting together that overarching narrative and that overarching story. And that is really all I have.